My name is Sophia, and today I'm going to tell you about an experience that I will never forget. An experience that to this day leaves me with doubts and goosebumps whenever I remember the details. At the time, I was only 17 years old, and our family was facing a difficult battle. My father was diagnosed with a serious illness. The prognosis was grim, but he decided to fight, undergoing all possible treatments, even knowing the suffering it would bring. My mother, determined to support him, also changed completely. She began to pray daily, at dawn and dusk, with an intense devotion that brought radical changes to our home. After a long journey of treatments and unwavering faith, my father finally recovered, surprising all the doctors. My mother was certain that God had guided the hands of the best professionals, that He had blessed each stage of the treatment, giving him a new chance at life. This experience left a deep impression on her, and she began to dedicate herself to church activities, especially supporting other people who were seeking hope and help in difficult times. Before that, our family was not religious. My parents had raised me and my older sister without faith, and we were skeptical about the supernatural. However, we supported my mother's new faith, albeit with a dose of irony. I used to pick my mother up from church when she finished her work, especially because of the isolated path and the dim lighting in the neighborhood. The street had more abandoned houses than inhabited ones, a desolate scene. One of those days I went to pick her up after a First Communion ceremony. When I arrived, only a few people were still taking photos. The inside of the church was almost empty and the lights were starting to go out. As usual, I sat in the last pew to wait, and the priest told me that my mother was in a room next door with a volunteer and that he would be out soon. He asked me to take off my hat, which I did, even though I was reluctant. Then he left to take a photo with a group, closing the doors and leaving the room in a somber silence, lit only by the candles on the altar. While I waited, I thought about the people who came there asking for help, searching for something greater. In the midst of these thoughts, I realized that I was no longer alone. Up ahead in the first row, something white seemed to be moving. A small figure covered by a veil was sitting, as if waiting for someone. I became curious and stood up, believing that it was one of the children at the ceremony, perhaps waiting for their parents or someone from the church. With light steps I approached, thinking of warning her that the priest had already locked the doors. When I got closer, she turned her face to me, but her veil covered her eyes, hiding her features. She then stood up and began walking towards a side door that led to a small room. Her movements were strange. Her dress dragged on the floor, and somehow it seemed as if she were floating without moving her feet. I called her attention, trying to warn her that this was not the right way out, but she kept going. I followed her, watching her walk down the long corridor at the side of the church. Up ahead, the path split. On the left, the room where my mother was, and on the right, an exit to the back where the girl followed. The back door opened, and I continued, thinking that perhaps she had someone waiting outside. But when I reached the door, I realized that there was nothing there but a dark, empty lot. Her figure was now a few meters away, almost invisible in the darkness, but her white dress made her stand out in the dim light. Then, something surprising happened. The dress slipped to the floor, revealing an aged figure covered in skin so wrinkled that it looked like a being from another world. The creature slowly moved away, disappearing further and further into the darkness of the night. Frightened, I thought that perhaps it was a lost and confused old woman, and I decided to follow her to help. But as soon as I took a few steps, the darkness seemed to envelop me so that I could see nothing but the ground beneath my feet. I took out my cell phone to light the way, but the night fog absorbed the light, making it impossible to see anything around me. Confused and scared, I decided to go back. When I passed the spot where the white dress had fallen, I saw only a strange stain on the floor, as if it were a mixture of cement and dust. Back in the hallway, I found the priest, my mother, and another volunteer. I told them what had happened, but the priest reprimanded me, asking me not to talk about it anymore. The other volunteer was pale and silent, while my mother asked me to gather her things so we could leave. As we left, the volunteer who was supposed to take a shorter route decided to follow us, clearly shaken by what I had described. The two whispered to each other, but avoided speaking directly about what happened, as if there was something dark that they preferred not to reveal. When we finally got home, the volunteer hurriedly said goodbye and left. I tried to ask my mother about what I had seen, But she just told me not to worry about such things and to look for a logical explanation. Since then, people in my family laugh and make fun of me whenever I mention this story, especially my sister. Even so, every time there is a First Communion ceremony and I need to pick up my mother, I make sure to bring company. After all, certain things leave a deep mark, and if you have ever been through something similar, you know what I'm talking about. What about you? Have you ever had a supernatural experience or witnessed something inexplicable? Share in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let's move on to the next story. Good evening, everyone. My name is Clara, and today I want to share a brief story with you. It is an experience that, despite being simple, left a deep impression on me. I assure you that what I am about to tell you is true, without exaggeration. This happened in San Andres, in the state of Jalisco, and as strange as it may seem, those who have experienced it with me know how frightening it was. I am studying architecture, and as many of you can imagine, teamwork is essential for our projects. To make things easier, we usually meet at a friend's house, which is a strategic point for everyone. However, there is a peculiar detail about this house. It is located just a few meters from an old cemetery. On the night in question, we met there to work on a particularly complicated model. We were on a tight deadline, so we decided that, if necessary, we would stay up all night working. Despite drinking countless cups of coffee and trying to stay alert by talking, we were already exhausted by around 3 in the morning. We were so tired that we could barely keep our eyes open. It was then that someone suggested that we take an hour to rest and regain some energy, even though we knew it wasn't ideal. We were so exhausted that we ended up accepting the idea. Each of us settled in a corner. I lay down on the sofa in the living room. It was in this moment of silence that, out of nowhere, we began to hear distant crying coming from the street. We found it funny and exchanged nervous giggles because the sound had something strange, almost supernatural. Since we were all together, the fear wasn't as intense, and someone joked that now we could say we heard La Llorona, a legendary figure that we all know, the spirit of a woman in white, disheveled and crying, who allegedly took the lives of her own children, and then regretted it, being cursed to wander in suffering. But something made us shudder. They say that if you hear her wailing from far away, it's because she's actually very close. And suddenly we heard the sound again, but this time clear and sharp, as if it were right outside the house. A shiver ran through everyone, and our eyes turned, almost at the same time, to the doors and windows. Everything seemed locked and secure, but the feeling that something was wrong only grew. We were ready to try to forget about it, when we noticed something disturbing. A rosary that my friend kept hanging next to the door was spinning, as if an invisible hand was making it spin with force. There was no wind. Nothing to justify that movement. The crying stopped, but the tension in the air remained. My friend ran to the room to check on her sleeping son, but everything seemed normal with him. However, the idea of going back to sleep or even resting was out of the question. Fear still dominated us all. With no other option, we decided to focus on the work and finish the model, ignoring the terror we felt. To this day, we joke that thanks to the presence of La Llorona, or whatever that was, we were able to complete the project.
My name is Ricardo, and I come from a small town called Colinas Verdes in the interior of the state of São Paulo. The story I'm about to tell happened to my father, who unfortunately is no longer with us. Whenever I remember this episode, I'm still surprised by how strange it was. Back in the 1960s, movies were the main form of entertainment for many people. At that time, my father, who was only 12 years old at the time, went to the neighborhood movie theater with his sisters, my aunts. However, they soon got tired of the movie and decided to leave before the end, leaving my father alone, because he wanted to see the outcome. When the movie ended, he left the theater to find Thor, his faithful dog, who was waiting patiently for him outside. The two of them started walking back home late at night. They were just a few blocks away when Thor suddenly stopped and started growling, his fur standing on end. In an instant, the dog took off running, leaving my father alone and scared, not understanding what was happening. Despite his apprehension, he decided to continue on his way. Further ahead, as he passed a ravine, my father saw something that froze him, a woman standing, dressed entirely in white, with her head lowered. The figure had her back to the moonlight, which gave her an unusual glow, and her dress fluttered in the wind, which only increased the ghostly impression. Overcome with fear, my father looked up, and to his horror saw that her eyes were glowing an intense red, like those of a wild animal. Without hesitation, he ran home, arriving almost breathless, pale as a sheet of paper. My grandmother, worried, asked what had happened, but the only thing he could say was that he had seen a ghost. Years after this incident, as an adult, my father lived alone in a boarding house. During the day he worked, and at night he studied geography at university, dreaming of becoming a teacher. His routine was intense, divided between work and studies. One night it was very late. My father was sleeping when he was awakened by the sound of the bedroom door opening by itself. He barely had time to process what was happening when he noticed a figure dressed entirely in white entering the room, stopping next to his bed. Terrified, he felt his entire body freeze, and not knowing what to do, he closed his eyes and began to pray, hoping that it would disappear. After some time, his heart calmed down, and he was able to fall asleep again. The next morning, he convinced himself that it had only been a dream. But another night, when he went to bed, he felt the same presence entering the room again. His body froze, and an intense cold ran down his spine. It was then that he felt something touch his feet. They were hands, and they were colder than anything he had ever felt. Almost every night after that, this presence returned to visit him. Not knowing how to deal with this situation, a friend suggested that he look for a spiritualist center. At the center, they said it could be the spirit of someone seeking help, and that he would need to confront the entity. Determined to put an end to it, my father prepared himself for the next visit. When the entity appeared that night and approached the bed, he, in a burst of courage or desperation, stood up and grabbed the figure by the arms. He described the sensation as surreal, as if he were holding something solid but strange, comparing it to a broomstick. Face to face, he could clearly see the face of a young woman and asked if she needed help. When she got no answer, he insisted, "Do you want me to light a candle and say a prayer so that you can find peace and rest?" This time, the woman gave a slight nod of agreement. In the middle of the night, my father knelt down, lit a candle, and prayed for the spirit to find peace. From that day on, the visits stopped. After this experience, he began to attend the spiritualist center occasionally. Much later, he learned, through a medium, that the spirit that visited him was that of a nurse who had taken her own life using poison.